turn to Senator McKim.
Well, thanks very much, Chair, and good morning, Dr. Lowe. Thanks very much for coming in before the committee this morning. I wanted to start by just going back to the forward guidance you issued in February 2021, and I am aware of the review that the RBA has released recently in terms of the review of your approach to forward guidance. But look, in February 2021, you did say that the board would not increase the cash rate until actual inflation is sustainably within the 2 to 3% target range, and that for this to occur, wages growth will have to be materially higher than it is currently. Do you accept that those conditions actually have not been met?
No, I don't accept that at all. I mean, if I just take you back to our thinking, we were very clear that we were going to wait till we saw the evidence that inflation had picked up before we increased interest rates. So we wanted people to understand that, and then rightly people were saying, well, what would you require to see to conclude that inflation was sustainably in that 2 to 3% range? And our thinking was that we would need to see wages growth picking up from the low rates of 2%, because we'd had 4 or 5 years where wages were growing at 2%, and that clearly wasn't enough to deliver inflation at 2.5%. And we wanted to see wages growth pick up close to 3%.
Close to, sorry?
Close to at least 3%, because if we're going to deliver an average inflation rate of 2.5%, then I think wages on average have to grow at least 3%. And in early 2021, that was not the case, and it was only in the first part of this year that it became evident to us that wages growth was picking up, and we were confident that it would average at least 3% over the course of this year. So by the time those conditions were met, we were April, May this year, and we raised interest rates then.
Okay, but that's nominal wages, right?
Yeah,
so
wages,
it's real wages that actually matter to people, isn't it? I mean, nominal wages can go up, but people's purchasing powers can still decline.
Well, of course, that's exactly right. But the job of the central bank is a nominal job. We've got to deliver you 2.5% inflation. It'd be fantastic if we could have growth in real wages of 1-2% a year, but that's not within my control. If we're going to have growth in real wages of 1 or 2% a year, we've got to have strong productivity growth in the country. And that's one reason why I keep on talking about the need to refocus on the productivity agenda, because we can only have growth in real wages over time if we get better at doing things. And that requires productivity growth, and that requires reform.
All right.
So I agree 100% with you, but our job as a central bank is a nominal one.
Thank you. You did say that it would be unlikely that that would occur until 2024, and I accept that's a caveated statement. But do you accept that the way that statement was broadly reported, which was without the caveats, had the effect effectively of inducing many Australians to taking out mortgages in the belief that interest rates wouldn't rise until 2024, and now of course they're faced with 7 months and potentially more of interest rate rises. So do you accept that you did in fact induce Australians to take out mortgages on the basis that interest rates wouldn't rise until 2024, and do you think you owe those people an apology?
Well, I'm certainly sorry if people listened to what we'd said and then acted on that, what we'd said, and now regret what they had done. So that's regrettable, and I'm sorry that that happened. But if I can just take you back to the situation we were facing in 20 and 2021, it was the country was in a dire situation, and the Reserve Bank, we wanted to do everything we could to help the country get through that. We also had a strong insurance mindset. We were thinking, well, what could go wrong here? And the thing that could go wrong was really, really bad. You know, we're talking about 15% unemployment, a generation of young kids not being able to find jobs, people not being able to go to school and university. It was dire times. And we decided that we would do everything we could. That included the term funding facility and the bond purchase program, you know, all the things we did. And we also thought that given the dire outlook, it was unlikely that inflation would pick up quickly, and we wanted to send a message that interest rates were going to stay low for a long period of time. At the time, I thought that was the right thing to do. Ex post, the economy recovered much more quickly than anyone expected, and we've had to raise interest rates more quickly, and people who borrowed in those 2 years are now finding it much more difficult. But I'm sorry that people listened to what we'd said and acted on that, and now find themselves in a position they don't want to be in. But at the time, we thought it was the right thing to do, and I think looking back, we would have chosen different language. You're right, people did not hear the caveats in what we said. My language was always caveated, but I thought it was clear, but from the central bank kind of perspective, but the community didn't think it was clear. Well, they thought it was clear that we weren't raising rates till 24, didn't they? That's a failure on our part. We didn't communicate the caveats clearly enough, and we've certainly learnt from that. And if you've had a look at the review of forward guidance, we're changing our approach. But we didn't get across the caveats clearly enough, and the community heard 2024. They didn't hear the conditionality, and that's partly our fault. We weren't clear enough. I agree.
Thanks, Dr. Lowe. I do have some questions about the TFF
Yep.
and some of the money printing side of things a little bit later. But I did just want to refer you to the speech you gave last week, where you identified the higher likelihood of supply-side inflation pressures into the future, including as a result of climate change. And just ask you, do you think that interest rate rises are an appropriate response to supply-side pressures?
Well, it depends. If you have a supply-side shock that pushes inflation up and the supply-side shock reverses, then you'd expect inflation to come back down and you don't need to raise interest rates. So that would be kind of a standard textbook response to a supply-side shock. So that would be the standard. The caveat, though, is if the period of high inflation leads to a shift up in inflation expectations, inflation rises and people think it's going to continue, then that gets factored into both wage-setting behaviour and pricing decisions by firms. And then a temporary shock persists. And if it were to persist, then you need higher interest rates to deal with it. And in some countries around the world, it's clearly persisting. You've had a sequence of supply-side shocks and price and wage-setting behaviour has responded. Profit margins in some countries are going up and wages in many countries are rising at 6% a year. And 6% wage growth isn't consistent with 2% inflation unless you have fantastic productivity growth, which no one's delivering. So it depends on what responses you see as a result of the supply shock. And we're in this intermediate period now. We're unsure about what responses are going on in the labour market and price-setting behaviour and how persistent they'll be. So it really depends upon the persistence of the supply shocks and what else changes as a result of that.
Thank you. I've got some questions around profit margins a little bit later as well, Dr. Lowe, just to flag that. But on as a follow-up to the last question, I want to ask you, do you think that in terms of tackling supply-side shocks, or inflation driven at least in significant part by supply-side shocks, do you think that things like price caps or taxes targeted at those with a greater capacity to pay are more appropriate tools to tackle inflation driven by supply-side shock, as opposed to, for example, interest rate rises? The best way, one way of tackling inflation induced by supply-side shocks is to address the supply side, and at the moment there are two areas I think we could be focusing on. It's the supply of gas and electricity in the domestic market, what we can constructively do to increase the supply, and I don't want to get drawn into kind of what the right measures are, but just at the analytical level, increased supply of gas and electricity in the domestic market would be helpful. And the other supply side issue we're focused on is the supply of housing, because the rental vacancy rate now is quite low. The population growth is picking up. I'm imagining that we'll see increased pressure on rents over the next year as population growth collides with fairly modest growth in the supply of housing. So the supply of gas and electricity and the supply of housing, if we can address those two issues, that will make a substantial contribution to bringing inflation back down over the next couple of years. Understood. And if I've got
Yep.
time, I've
Yep.
got some questions on housing as well that I'd like to ask you. So obviously got a little bit to get through, but I'm sure other members of the committee do too. But I did...
Your last question.
Thank you, and I appreciate that, thanks. So just as a follow-up to that,
Yep.
Dr Lowe, you've addressed supply side, but interest rate rises are designed in part to address demand
Yep.
in the economy, right? So wages. Yep. So in that context of the RBA taking action to address the demand side pressures that you argue need addressing, don't you think that there are other tools in the toolkit, not necessarily the RBA's toolkit, I might add, but in government's toolkit, that, for example, as I said before, price caps or taxes targeted at those with the greater capacity to pay, that are more appropriate tools than the blunt instrument of interest rate rises?
Well, it's not. I don't see it as either or. We've got demand in the economy that's putting pressure on the supply side of the economy. So demand is too strong relative to the economy's ability to produce goods and services. So higher interest rates affect the demand side, and there are things we can do on the supply side. I don't want to endorse the proposals you were just putting, but increasing the supply of gas and electricity and housing will make a difference to the price of gas, electricity and rents. So we had to raise interest rates for two reasons. The first is low interest rates were part of the insurance package. We didn't need the insurance package in the end, so we had to take back the insurance. So that was part of the story, and get interest rates back to something close to normal. And then in addition to that, we've had to increase interest rates because demand in the economy is very strong. So we took back the insurance, and we've had to do a bit more because of the strength of demand. And that's certainly part of the way we get inflation back down. But if we can fix the supply side, that'll help as well. But we just can't, it's not a matter of choosing one or the other. I think we've got to do both.